It's a pleasure to see you all here on this lovely Upper Valley day. My name is Bill Wolforth. I'm a professor in the Department of Government here at Dartmouth, and there's plenty of seats up here. No one will ask you questions. There'll be no pressure if you come up close to the front. If you have to leave early, we'll understand. And it's my great pleasure to welcome to Dartmouth and introduce today's speaker, who is Stephen Kotkin, who's a professor of history and international affairs at Princeton University, a holder of many distinguished and important posts at that institution, and a scholar who in many ways is perfectly positioned to talk to you about today's subject, which is trying to understand authoritarian regimes, which may seem to be teetering on the edge, but seem to last forever, and may seem to be like the Rock of Gibraltar and always to be with us only to collapse immediately. How could, and with what scholarly background and credentials does Professor Kotkin arrive at this subject? Well, were I to talk about them in any depth, it would take far too much time away from his remarks. But just let's mention a few things. He has studied from the inside out in a groundbreaking monograph, The Dynamics of Stalinism from the Inside. He studied the collapse of the Eastern European Soviet regimes in 1989, which nobody expected. He studied things he studied and written authoritatively on contemporary politics in such non-perfectly democratic countries as Putin's Russia. He has addressed it from a contemporary perspective, from a ground-up perspective, from a top-down perspective, from a global perspective, and from a deep historical and contemporary perspective. Few scholars can manage that task as Stephen Kotkin has. And so it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Dartmouth, and look forward to your comments, Steve Kotkin.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for the invitation. This is my first time up here, so a nice opportunity. I've known Professor Wolforth for a long time. We were Princeton colleagues together in the early days, and he's known as the one who got away. He slipped through our grasp, and now you're the beneficiaries. But I have to say, we miss him. I'm going to give a very simple presentation because it's now 4:30, and you've probably been dealing all day with complex ideas, and you've probably had more than a day's worth of complex ideas, and so now it's going to be time to simplify a little bit. I'm going to introduce a couple of extremely simple propositions, illustrate them a little bit, and then if you're still here, we'll have question and answer. My first simple proposition is that authoritarian regimes are simultaneously very powerful and brittle. That this is an inherent characteristic of authoritarian regimes. They're not powerful for a while, and then they get brittle later. They're brittle all the way through. They suffer structural problems that even when they're strong, give them these inherent weaknesses. And therefore, they can collapse at any moment, or not collapse. We'll get into that in a second. My second proposition is that when authoritarian regimes collapse, they're replaced by authoritarian regimes. Some other version of themselves, because the stuff that makes up the new regime are usually the shattered pieces of the old regime. I used to give this talk and lose everybody right at that very moment. But having now lived through Egypt the past couple of years, audiences have all of a sudden become more receptive to this question of what, if anything, replaces an authoritarian regime. So those are my two simple propositions. I believe in truth in packaging. And now I'm going to go through a little bit and see if I can illustrate those points. And then I'll leave the individual cases for the most part, for a discussion. So if you want, for example, to discuss the China regime today, the Saudi regime, the Iranian regime, the Russian regime in detail, I'm very happy to do that, those and others, the UAE, Singapore. But I'm going to speak a little bit more generally to try to get some general patterns established rather than the nitty-gritty of specific regimes, but I'm very eager to discuss whatever specific regimes might be on your mind. So we don't really have very many dictatorships anymore. There's no Hitler, there's no Stalin, there's no Mao. There's no Baby Doc and Papa Doc. There's no Batista. There is still Castro, but not much. Antonescu, Ceausescu, Pilsudski, Dollfuss. I have a list of about 75 dictators on this sheet of paper who are just from the 20th century. So those regimes are mostly gone. And this has been a big problem of interpretation. How do you understand a regime that doesn't have a dictator? And we've been using vocabulary like, for example, semi-democracy, kind of a democracy, electoral democracy, ought to be a democracy. There's a whole vocabulary, a normative vocabulary of democratization to characterize the world's regimes. Because they're no longer dictatorships. I mean, obviously, they're not Mao. It's not Stalin, right? And yet, what are they? For about 20 years, the social sciences lost their way on these questions. I've been teaching at Princeton for 23 years, and for the past 23 years, I taught the only course on authoritarianism in the social sciences at Princeton. There were several hundred courses on democracy and democratization. Graduate students came to me to write dissertations on democratization in Central Asia, for example, after the fall of the Soviet regime. Of course, I refused to get involved in such topics because I'm not in the literature department. But anyway, now there's another course besides mine on authoritarianism at Princeton, and I predict that this will now become a trend. But for about 20 years, democratization and democracy were the dominant tropes in the social sciences, and as I say, we've kind of lost our way on analyzing authoritarian regimes. There's been a revival like this, geometric, just in the past couple of years, if you are subjecting yourself to, for example, the political science journals. You would know that. Once upon a time, in fact, political science actually cut its teeth on authoritarian regimes. One of the great social scientists of our time, Juan Linz, in the 1960s was disturbed that people were calling the Franco regime in Spain Hitlerite or fascist. And so Juan Linz, while Franco was still alive, while the regime was still in power, Franco lasted till 75, tried to make a distinction between totalitarian regimes, i.e. the Hitlers and the Stalins and the Maos, and authoritarian regimes. And it was a very important effort because Franco was something else. He wasn't a Hitler regime. There was something else there. The problem with Juan Linz's definition is it was what the Franco regime didn't have that distinguished it from the totalitarian regimes. It was mostly a negative characteristic. It wasn't the kind of thing that was easily generalizable. It didn't have a strong single party. It didn't have a strong ideology. It didn't have this and it didn't have that. Therefore, it was authoritarian. So Linz, as I say, one of the great social scientists of our epoch and tackling an important problem, which is how to characterize all those regimes that are not necessarily totalitarian but are something else. So I believe we're still with that problem today. Now, there have been many, many other efforts since Juan Linz. Juan Linz himself made other efforts. For example, he tried sultanistic regimes, which he took from Max Weber and got accused of orientalizing the problem of authoritarianism with sultanistic regimes. There's the caudillo phenomenon, which runs through the Latin American literature. And there are many other attempts to characterize these things which are non-democratic. And they're not democratizing, but they're not totalitarian. Okay, so we have this problem of how to deal with these regimes. China, Russia, Singapore, Dubai, Iran, some would even say Pakistan, I certainly would, and many others besides. Okay, so let's start out, rather than with a definition, which will just get into trouble, because I myself could rip it apart, let alone you in the audience. Let's start out with what I would call a discernible structure. So let's give the kind of overview pattern discernible structure of just about every authoritarian regime. First, reliable instruments of violence and repression. Reliable instruments of violence and repression. That's absolutely essential. You have to have motivated, well-fed thugs. They have to be ready to do various forms of dirty work, often on extremely short notice. If you don't have that, or they're incapable of rising to the call when summoned, either you don't have an authoritarian regime to begin with, or you don't have it anymore. So the FANGs, let's call that the FANGs, reliable instruments of violence and repression. Number two, you need cash flow. You have to have steady cash flow. Maybe it's the sale of hydrocarbons that you sort of extract out of the ground. Maybe it's diamonds. Or maybe you're Kyrgyzstan and you just use democracy aid to float your authoritarian regime. One of my students wrote a dissertation comparing Kazakhstan oil revenues and Kyrgyzstan democracy aid as the main sources of patronage for those authoritarian regimes. And the Kyrgyz did very well with democracy aid. They had other trouble. Okay, so you need cash flow. This could be anything. Counterfeiting $100 bills, counterfeiting 500 euro notes, whatever it might be. Because if you look at the budget of an authoritarian regime, it's very expensive, and it's a cash economy. You need bulletproof vests, depending on the size of your country, depending on your aspirations. For example, if you want to buy the Israeli model of bulletproof vests, the expensive model. You think AK-47s are cheap? They are. But those pistols with silencers are unbelievably expensive. You put together 10,000, 20,000 thugs, it's incredible. Between the bulletproof vests, the pistols, the silencers, the night vision goggles, what the expenses are. Add in the fact that everybody in the regime has a mistress, so you need rubies, you need emeralds, you need diamonds in big numbers, really big numbers. The import of jewels by authoritarian regimes is colossal. And you go down the budget of what an authoritarian regime looks like in practice, and it's this gigantic demand for cash. Because you're buying loyalty, you're floating that repressive apparatus, and you're buying loyalty in a cash economy. And the way you hurt an authoritarian regime is you cut the cash flow. That's the single most important policy tool available against any authoritarian regime. You cut the aorta, you cut the cash. You deny them access to the international banking system, and or you deny them their sources of foreign currency revenue. A lot of them don't have convertible currency, so they need foreign currency revenue, which is quite different. They need to have something which is saleable on world markets, unless they counterfeit the money themselves. So that's point number two. Patronage gets very expensive. Commodity prices can be extremely volatile. They're high, and then all of a sudden they're low, and you got an expensive regime, and you're broke. And you can't pay off the goons, the thugs. You can't pay anybody off. So you need a backup Even if you're a commodity-based economy, you need a backup. Maybe you hurl a piece of garbage, a hunk of metal, into the Sea of Japan and demand a ransom, for example. That's one way to raise a lot of cash. The North Koreans have been extremely successful over the years. They take a refrigerator or a washing machine, they put a lot of tin foil around it, and it's a satellite, and then they put it on what they call a rocket, which is this hunk of metal with a flame underneath it, and then they fishtail it up into the air, and if it doesn't disintegrate yet, it then will go somewhere in the water, and it'll be a missile launch, and then there'll have to be negotiations, and they'll need $300 or $400 or $500 million. It's a great gig if you can continue to do it. So I'm serious when I say you need cash flow. Cash flow like the thugs, well-motivated, well-fed thugs. Number three. Now, it's no small challenge, but it's not enough to demobilize potential opponents. You got to raise the cost of opposition as high as possible. Fines, jail terms, job loss, kids get thrown out of school, no visas to go abroad, right? You raise the stakes, the costs against opposition, against political mobilization. That's known as demobilizing the opposition. That's really important, but that's not enough. Because sometimes the costs are really high and people pay them anyway. And then what do? And the answer is, point number three, you have to be able to mobilize in the street, right? You need your own rent-a-crowd or mobilized crowd ready to go into action as pro-regime mobilization. This is a point that's not well understood. In Iran, in the summer of 2009, there were 3 million people in the streets of Tehran. 3 million. That's a pretty sizable number. Mobilized in opposition. 3 million demanding change. That regime didn't fold. It's still there. It's 3 years later. Right? There were all sorts of talk and prediction about that regime was in trouble. But that regime is able to mobilize hundreds of thousands of its own supporters. So-called Basij, so-called Revolutionary Guards, various militia groups, some of whom are there because they're paid, and most of whom are there because they have a belief system and they're paid. It's always nice when those things dovetail. So you need to be able to mobilize serious crowds. Anybody who doesn't have pro-regime mobilization is not in the game anymore in authoritarianism. Because you think your thugs are ready to go, you think, you've got them all paid and puffed up, they're all fattened up like holiday turkeys, and there's not going to be any trouble, and nobody's going to hit the streets because you're going to throw their kids out of school, or you're going to cut the visas off, and they won't be able to go to London for the next semester, or whatever it might be, and then poof, the streets are full of people all of a sudden. So you need to be able to get your people out in the streets in so-called counter-demonstrations, pro-regime mobilization. Okay. The fourth characteristic of authoritarian regimes. You'll see where this is going if you bear with me. I'm not that far from the end. You need to be able to manipulate, or better yet, control life opportunities. This is really, really important. Manipulate or control life opportunities, right? Here in the United States, we have basically 3 paths. College or university, you're on that path, right? College or university, that's the path that you're on. The Army, that's the other path. Sometimes paths 1 and 2 overlap, but often they don't. But the Army is a place where people go, they get a job, and they get skills. And the third path we have in our society is prison. Those are the basic 3 paths of society in the United States: college, university, the Army, and prison. I'm simplifying a little bit, but if you look at the numbers, that captures just about everybody. So if you can manipulate entrance or non-entrance into one of these life paths, For example, if you can control university entrance, you got a huge lever of power over your society. If you can award, or better yet, deny university entrance, that's a really big deal. If you can award or deny entrance to elite units of the Army, that's a really big deal. If you can award and deny trips abroad because you have an exit visa regime, right? Manipulating or controlling life opportunities is an incredible tool for an authoritarian regime. Those that are unable, even in a small way, to manipulate life opportunities find themselves losing control over the situation and perishing. Now, regimes are, societies are complex, but from the top, from an authoritarian regime point of view, if you're reading along with me the handbook of how to an authoritarian regime, which is what I'm presenting to you today, it actually looks not so complex. You have a certain number of universities and a certain number of university slots, and there's a president or a rector of that university, and you can summon that person to your office and explain to them, the procedures for getting into that university or not. And if that person doesn't go along, you can change the rector. It's great if it's a state system. That's a lot easier because the person's a state employee. But you can do that with employment across the whole economy. 90% of employment in Kuwait, for example, is state-controlled. 90%. 90% of employment pattern in Kuwait are state employees. Now, state employees are subject to state commands. And so, if you got a nice state company, maybe it's an oil company, maybe it's a chemical company, maybe it's just a car company, there's going to need to be a lot of executives there. Well, you can give people executive jobs, or you can not give people executive jobs. So the more statified your economy is, the more control potentially you might have over your life opportunities. Okay, that was point number 4. If things are scarce and if they're state, you got power. Now, you can do it all. It could be rationing of milk. It could get right down to the level of staples in the diet that you can control if you have mechanisms of control down in well-organized, mobilized community leaders. Anyway, the rewarding of loyalty and the punishment of disloyalty. Housing, even milk, as I say. Okay. 5th, you got to have influence, better yet control, over the key media. You got to own and or manage the television stations. It's just an absolute must. Internet is now also a must. Before it was a desirable, but now for an authoritarian regime, it's an absolute must. Now, it's nice if you can voluntarily get armies of people to enforce on a nationalist basis censorship and control over the internet, but that's hard work. That's like 24/7. You need to get your story out, and you need to block other stories, right? Because censorship is both the denial of certain forms of information and thinking and the promotion of certain forms of information, right? Censorship has a proactive dimension, not just denial. If you have no control over the public sphere, you're playing with fire. You don't have to have 100% control. There can be all sorts of pockets of things that go on that you don't control. Small market magazines, little tiny TV stations that don't reach anybody, right? Newspapers that nobody reads. Right? There are places where you don't have to control. You can husband your resources if you have limited resources and control over the public sphere. By the way, after this lecture, you get a certificate and you go to try this in one of your own authoritarian regimes. You get to go try it in real life. That's part of having gotten into Dartmouth. I do this myself at Princeton. I'm the vice dean of the policy school. Okay. 6th, you need to have a narrative. you need to have a story about who you are. And it has to have some purchase in the society. You need to have a well. And that well has to be a place where you can go, obviously when you get in trouble, and put the bucket down and bring up some big story. The story of foreign subversion. That's a big story, right? Somebody from the outside who's trying to get you. Foreign subversion is huge, especially if it connects to funny-looking people inside your country too, like ethnic minorities or religious minorities, right? That's a great thing to have in the well. You can pull that puppy up just about any time. Plausible external threat. The IMF, that's a great one. That works for just about every regime. The IMF. Look what they're trying to do to us. They're trying to take away our sovereignty. They're trying to make us do things for their benefit. The US, whoever you went to war with in the 12th or 11th century, it's all down in that well. You're going to put the bucket and lift it up. NGOs that receive foreign grants. NGOs, what's that? Does anybody believe that they're really non-governmental, that they're not taking the orders of the governments that give them grants, that fund them, that then come into our country and try to subvert our values and try to get our young people to work for them? Naive liberals, that's huge too. That's always in the bucket. They're always a subversive force. They think they're doing good, but they're in the pay of the foreigners, and they're subverting our country. Naive liberals are huge. Anyway, you get the picture, right? You need a well. It's based upon some nationalist understanding. It's based upon a threat. You can't be an authoritarian regime without a threat. You need a threat. A plausible external threat linked to a plausible internal threat. Right? It's just got to be. Now, so these 6 characteristics, right, that I just went through, not every regime has all 6. Some have 5 out of 6. That's pretty good. I'll take that. Some only have 3 out of 6, and you can see that they're rockier. And some have all 6, and some are churning all 6 on all cylinders. Those are the regimes you want to do FDI in. They got staying power. Okay. Now, there are other variables that I'm not really going to go into right now, but just to show you I'm not so simplistic, I'll mention them. There's the issue of the degree of institutionalization or not, right? There are professional armies, and then there are unprofessional armies, and it matters a lot, right? There are professional thugs, and there are unprofessional thugs. So the degree of institutionalization or not is really important, right? Sometimes you get a predominantly personalist regime that's based on a person, and that regime is not institutionalized, and so if that person gets, like, I don't know, liver cancer or sclerosis of the liver, there's no regime anymore because it's not deeply institutionalized, right? It's too personal. So there's that dimension, which I ought to go into greater depth to, but I'm not. Personalized regimes have trouble with blunders much more because authoritarian regimes lack corrective mechanisms, and if the person blunders a couple of times, there's a very high likelihood they'll blunder often, and it becomes a big problem that you have, especially if they have a son or a daughter and there's a regression to the mean in the genes. Now, this degree of professionalization is really important for the post-regime. This is going to sound, this is going to actually skirt the line here, but the judiciary in the apartheid regime in South Africa was valuable. And the reason it's valuable is because it understood property rights. Now, it understood property rights only for a very narrowly defined citizenry. It enforced apartheid regime on the vast majority of the country. But if you expand the category citizen and you apply the property rights law to more citizens, you got a judiciary that could work. The communist era judiciaries, they didn't understand property rights. And they're of not much value in a post-communist transition because they don't get it. It's not that they're defending the rights of party figures to hold property and then they let everybody hold property, like the South African regime defends the rights of a handful of people, white property owners, and then they can defend the property rights of other people because they understand the way law works. So institutionalization can be crucially important in what happens when the regime topples. When you get those shards and you're trying to put together something else, institutionalization or not matters a lot. Or even when you're trying to overcome the regime. Professional armies with a security threat are very difficult to overcome. Very, very difficult to overcome. Because they're the life opportunities, they're the ideology, they're just, it's a rich thing. The Pakistan, Egyptian cases with professional armies are trouble to overcome stuff like that. Very difficult. It looked like the Chinese communists regained control over the military by forcing it partially out of business, out of the private economy in the 90s. It took something as strong as, or what looked strong, the Chinese Communist Party, to, as it were, domesticate the Chinese military in the 90s and kick it out of a lot of private business. Now we're seeing maybe that was a premature judgment on party control over the Chinese army. Analysts in the intelligence community, let alone in academia where they don't know the information on the inside, but intelligence analysts are split on the degree of control or not on the Chinese army. So, but in Pakistan, where the army, the professional army, exists as the reason of the state because of the threat from India and also owns a great deal of the economy, is extremely difficult to eradicate. Okay, anyway, so those were just sort of sidebars, that there are other things that need to be talked about, like the degree or not of institutionalization, right? But this nationalism, populism, law and order which is often ignored. We often think that authoritarian regimes are cynical, but in fact they have belief mechanisms and they have loyalties which are based not solely on payoffs, but on versions of nationalism, populism, and so-called law and order, right? The external threat, the subversion. Okay, now, it could be the case that having a full-fledged ideology is actually a weakness. The Iranian regime, for example, has this problem where they had an Islamic revolution. And when they fall short of an Islamic revolution, they get in trouble. They get critiqued on the basis of Islamism. And so having a full-fledged ideology is very empowering, it seems, but it can also be a point of vulnerability. Not having a full-fledged ideology, but just going to the well when you need it, looks like it's less empowering, but maybe more empowering. Okay, so let's summarize. So if you're a would-be analyst of an authoritarian regime, or you're a would-be creator of an authoritarian regime, there are such schools that you can go to. You need to understand politics and institutions, economics, sociology and social control, culture and the media, and of course the international system, just for the 6 attributes that I listed, let alone other attributes that I could go into. Now, a really good, that is to say a lucky authoritarian regime, gets its own populace to conduct most of the surveillance. That's a trick that is one great way to measure an authoritarian regime. where the society conducts surveillance on itself and reports on behavior that it observes of its citizens or fellow residents. Whether that's through housing committees or workforce people, that is to say in the places of employment, or self-centering on the internet or whatever, right? Social control imposed by the society itself. That costs a lot less and you get a lot more bang for your buck. There are only so many policemen in any authoritarian regime, but there's a big society to conduct surveillance on itself. So that's one way you measure the sophistication and strength of a regime. Anyway, now, here's the problem. The problem, which is the proposition I started with. Success brings decay. Success brings trouble to authoritarian regimes. They constantly undermine themselves on purpose. On purpose. Not because they're stupid or they get things wrong, but it's in the nature of who they are and how they operate. For example, they establish overlapping jurisdictions to make sure that one institution doesn't get too powerful. One state agency, one ministry, one bureaucracy doesn't get too powerful so that it could maybe push the leader aside, for example. So they establish tremendous numbers of overlapping jurisdictions. So it's often very hard to get anything done inside the regime, because 3 and 5 and 7 agencies are responsible for the same thing, and they're not going to want anybody else to get any credit. So they deny the other agencies and ministries the opportunity to perform their own functions. So by the desire not to have any one agency get too powerful, they can paralyze themselves. This happens again and again inside authoritarian regimes. Assign a second body to watch the first body, and assign a third body to watch the second body, and pretty soon you've got a morass. Now, at the same time, in order to make sure that you're getting information up the pipeline, in order to make sure that people are reporting what's going on, you need tremendous numbers of rivalries, jealousies, mutual hatreds inside the regime. The army has to hate the police have to hate the army has to hate the Navy has to hate the army. Otherwise, you never find out what's going on. It's because the Navy hates the army that the Navy tattles on the army and tells you what's actually going on in the army. But these rivalries and jealousies, these cutthroat competition within authoritarian regimes also is extremely dysfunctional. Extremely dysfunctional. The overlap, the sabotage, very inefficient, often debilitating. Authoritarian regimes become extremely ponderous. They start to get fat. They start to proliferate agencies. They start to have so many investigative bodies that nothing gets investigated anymore, because everybody is investigating everyone at the same time. There are many other problems that I could go into. The so-called cutting off the head of the tallest flower, or sometimes what's known as negative selection. Negative selection is when you're the leader of the club and you want to stay the leader of the club, and you appoint as your deputy the stupidest person in the room besides yourself. And that way you're never under threat, because that person is just not smart enough to outsmart you and to take power away from you. And that's at the top, and then at the next level, and the next level. So everybody is looking for a less competent deputy than themselves. This is known, as I say, as negative selection. You select for incompetence, lack of initiative, lack of foresight. This is a huge problem in all authoritarian regimes. I see it where I work all the time. Yes, I do. The fear of the talented is a big problem, a very big problem. Now, there are many other problems that I could go into, authoritarian regimes. The biggest one, though, is the succession problem. You see, life is good. I got mine, you got yours. Nobody asks any questions. My kids are going to school at LSE. Maybe I got another kid at Dartmouth. It's a big price tag. It's 10 times my nominal salary, but I'm not feeling the pinch. I got a Maybach for rides around the neighborhood to show everybody that I'm to be feared and to be taken seriously. My wife has a jewel on every finger, and my mistress has 2 jewels on every finger. My kids have birthday parties in Dubai, where whoever it is, some doggy dog is the performer. Right? Yeah. And so I'm living large. But you know, how can I be sure that tomorrow I'm going to be living large too? What's the guarantee that all my loyalty, all the dirty work I'm doing for this regime is going to be recognized tomorrow and the day after tomorrow? I mean, what would happen, for example, if the leader got sick and a new person came in and it was the person that, you know, I didn't treat that well before, or whatever the case might be? The succession ambiguity of authoritarian regimes is crippling every single day. Not just when Mubarak is 82 and has cancer, and nobody takes Gamal, his son, seriously. Then it's clear as day, right, that you got no future with this regime. If a guy's 82 and is sick, and the son is not going to handle the situation, you have a problem. That's clear. But when they're 55, they can still get cancer. When they're 55, there can be a coup, or the price of oil could go down, or all sorts of things can happen. So even when an authoritarian regime looks like it's not in a succession crisis, it's in a permanent succession crisis. And there's never a secure future in an authoritarian regime. That's why the money is in Liechtenstein. It's in Slovakia. It's wherever it has to be. Because you never know. Push comes to shove and events happen really quickly. And, you know, they cut off the banking system. And, I mean, so these people, they live in a world of succession ambiguity. So therefore, another measure of an authoritarian regime is its ability to handle authoritarian successions. And until recently, the Chinese regime was considered the gold standard in authoritarian succession. Right? Deng Xiaoping gave up power while he was still alive, and there was an authoritarian transition. And then there was a second authoritarian transition that brought that bozo who's in now. And now we expect a third authoritarian transition. Nobody was shot. There were no massive purges. Right? There was no violent redistribution of property. That's how they usually have successions in authoritarian regimes. It was pretty smooth. Behind the scenes, they cut a deal. The elite got together and they cut a deal and they gave portfolios and things out and they balanced things. And they had an authoritarian succession that was peaceful and stable. Mechanisms that are not transparent, that we don't fully understand, that many people who claim to understand don't know either, even if they're on the inside, because you don't know any more on the inside of these regimes than you do on the outside. That's another point for a different day's lecture. Anyway, so my point is just that authoritarian regimes have these inherent problems. These inherent problems are something they can't really do much about. They can try, right? But the information degrades. the governance apparatus decays. The ambiguity over the succession is a problem psychologically and more than psychologically. It leads people to take action sometimes. When they're afraid of what the succession might be, they themselves might try their own succession. And you get a coup or a putsch inside the regime, sometimes because of the ambiguity over the succession issue. Okay, in conclusion. So nobody should feel sorry for authoritarian regimes. I just want to make that clear. You should not, this is not an attempt to elicit sympathy on their behalf because they have it hard. But I do hope I've made the point that authoritarian regimes are not just the absence of democracy. They're not default. Oh, they don't have democracy, therefore they're an authoritarian regime. Authoritarian regimes, like Juan Lintz was trying to say, are something that have to be created. They have to be established. You need to work to get these attributes, the 6 attributes that I talked about. You need to have those mechanisms of repression. You need to have the cash flow. An authoritarian regime is, in fact, an achievement. It's not easy to do, and it's not easy to maintain because it has this inherent tendency to undermine itself when it's successful. Now, the usual problems that we think authoritarian regimes have may not be the real problems. You know, for example, disloyalty of intellectuals. Exactly. Disloyalty of intellectuals. The number of intellectuals who are not loyal inside authoritarian regimes is so small, so small. My favorite is the case study of the Italian fascist regime and how many professors resigned their position at university when Mussolini came to power. Anybody know the answer to this? Google it. It's one of the numbers in the algorithm. You know the algorithm, 0 or 1? So, things that we normally see as threatening to authoritarian regimes may not be the biggest problems that they have. The biggest problems that authoritarian regimes have are mostly themselves, because this is a hard thing to do, and when you do it well, things get worse. Almost every authoritarian regime decays. It can improve for a while and perform better, but it gets to a point where it decays. There's very little steady state authoritarianism, very little. The succession problem clearly indicates that, but the information problem, the governance problem, there are many different structural reasons for the decay in an authoritarian regime. We haven't talked about, but should talk about, the international environment and the ways in which it's conducive or not to authoritarianism. You know, the hand bites that feeds. One day they're loaning you money, and the next day they're telling you got to get on a plane and fly out of there. Right? The international environment can also be very tricky for these regimes. It's a friend, but then it's not a friend. And it can be very whimsical. So that's another destabilizing factor, and it's a factor entirely out of their control. There are very few small states that behave like big states. Big states just do what they want, and then if it complies with international law, they claim credit for complying with international law, and if it doesn't comply with international law, they tell you that international law doesn't apply to them in this particular case, right? And they can do really dumb things and walk away to do dumb things another day, right? That's what a big state is. Small states, they don't have those types of options, and most countries are not big states. And only one small state that I know gets away with behaving like a big state. I won't mention the name of that state, but I think you know which one I'm talking about. Okay. So, deliberate but self-defeating inefficiency, debilitating negative selection. We didn't even get to the part about rampant cronyism in the key agencies, like running the economy and running the police force. The internal lies because of the disincentives to report the truth. The lack of basic information about their own societies. They get so good at manipulating the public sphere that they think things are good in the country. And then they get, quote, shocked when they find 10,000 or 100,000 people in the streets, because that's not what they've been reading about their own society. In fact, the more you study authoritarian regimes, the more you see that it's a wonder that they survive at all. Because, as I say, it's their very success that undermines them. Their very strengths threaten their own survival. Now, just the final point, I see I'm out of time. Is that accurate?
Yep.
Okay. So, on the issue, I thought I was going to talk about this more, but maybe we'll end here. On the issue of what happens when they're toast, when they go up in smoke, right? Mubarak is gone. They sack him. It took them a while. It took them a lot to get up the courage, because there had been negative selection at the top of the Egyptian military. There were a bunch of weenies up there. And even though they had no future with Mubarak, even though the whole thing was toast, it took them a while to get rid of him. It took the courage of all those people who hit the streets day after day, right? Which they then used as a pretext to sack Mubarak. And then, of course, lo and behold, that interest group, that professional agency, that professional army is looking to hold on, right? But they have incompetence, inability to rule, inability to run things, and there are still courageous people in the society. Right? So the Egyptian story could go on like this for quite some time, or it could topple over like that. But if it were to topple over like that, right? If the courageous people were to hit the streets again, or if the military was just going to panic and get on a plane and flee, that's what they mostly used to do, right? Get on a plane and get out of there, like that guy in North Africa did, right? I think there was a little bit of trouble. He got on a plane and poof, that was the first one, the North African one. Remember that? The Tunisian one, I think it was? Yeah. The problem is that you need to institutionalize alternatives to the authoritarian regime. That's the trouble, right? The problem is you need a judiciary. How do you get a judiciary? That's a really hard thing to create, a judiciary. A successful, professional, semi-autonomous judiciary, right? You topple the bum, and then where do you go, like, to open the cupboard and pull out a judiciary? It's tough. You need a civil service. You think judiciary is hard. You need a civil service, right, that performs state functions without taking the money themselves. That's a really hard thing to get. And I could go on down the list of things that you need, right? You need media that are not controlled by a single person who just happens to be really rich. And when they privatize the station, because the state dictator was toppled, then you get a controlled media again, but controlled in a different way, right? You have issues of institutions that need to be created that the authoritarian regime doesn't have and doesn't want to have, and that are difficult to create on the fly in a transition. And it's one of the reasons you get another incarnation, maybe dumber, maybe weaker, maybe better from an authoritarian point of view, of the previous regime. You often get mush for really long periods of time. For example, the Kyrgyzstan case that I was talking about. I mean, those guys, they don't even have a police force. It's just so pathetic, right? I mean, all that cash that came through democracy aid and their Ministry of Interior is still mush, right? You often get this mush for a while before somebody has the wherewithal to consolidate, to establish, consolidate, and maintain an authoritarian regime, which I said isn't a perverse achievement, right? So it's very difficult to get an institutionalized alternative for the reason that the authoritarian regime, while it's alive, is denying things like your judiciary or a civil service. The very key institutions you need. You don't need hope alone. You don't need votes or elections alone. There are a lot of places that have parliaments. I remember when Slobodan Milosevic was elected, for example, right? If he hadn't lost 4 wars, he'd still be there. So this is the difficult problem, is it's very hard to figure out. I guess that's why we're dependent on you to figure this out. You know, smart young people who are going to be in situations like this, how you get from an authoritarian regime being toppled, or, as in most cases, toppling itself, being replaced by something better that's long-term and institutional. Anyway, we'll end there. Thank you very much for your time.
Would you like me to take questions first, or do you want to just point at raised hands as you wish?
You're the host. You tell me how you'd like to do
Why don't you
this.
just take your own questions? Folks, please.
Sure.
Has there been an example in history where an authoritarian regime has been toppled and the people have created a fully democratic regime on their own without foreign intervention?
Sure, there are such examples. And there are even debates about the cases where it looks like foreign intervention, but some people in the debate say that the foreign intervention wasn't the decisive factor. And those few cases where there's been success give hope that it can be done or replicated in other cases. So the obvious successes, West Germany and Japan post-World War II, those are the 2 most important successes. And then there's a debate in both of those cases whether the US occupation was or was not a decisive factor, or whether the society themselves established stable market economies and stable democracies. Right? It's a difficult debate to resolve. I'm not going to rehearse that debate right now, but those are the 2 most important cases from which this literature begins. There's the case of Turkey during and after Ataturk. That's considered a really important case. There's the case of South Korea, also considered a crucial case. And there's the case of Taiwan. Right? Those are the most referred to cases where you had a serious, for real authoritarian regime, and then you got something much better, which is now a stable rule of law order. Right? There are a couple of other cases, but those are the main ones in the literature. And then there are many more cases where you didn't get that. And so people try to isolate what the factors were in those successful cases and see how they can be applied. Right? Do you need foreign occupation or not, which was part of your question, right? Or do you need foreign pressure or not to democratize? Right? And the answer is that the establishment of the rule of law part, the constitutional order, that's the key variable that people spend less time figuring out or have less to say about. They can tell you where the elections came from, where the new political party system came from, how they got a parliament, for example, or in some cases a quasi-parliament. Right? But a lot of places with parliaments or quasi-parliaments don't have the other pieces. The rule of law, the judiciary, and the civil service. The civil service, which is, it's always a degree, mostly non-corrupt, right? Can I have a parenthesis right here? So corruption is obviously a deeply misused term. And corruption can sometimes actually be something other than corruption. And so we have to be very careful when we use the term corruption. But this will concretize the problem. So a Japanese civil servant in the Ministry of Roads goes to China. And he makes $10,000 a month in Japan. And he meets his counterpart in the Ministry of Roads in China. And the Ministry of Roads guy in China, he makes $1,000 a month rather than $10,000 as a salary. And his house is 10 times larger. So 1/10 the salary and 10 times larger the house. So it's not really polite to ask, but the Japanese civil servant can't resist. And he says, you know, I mean, you make 1/10 of what I make, and yet your house is 10 times larger. There's something that I don't understand. And he takes him over to the window, and he says, you see that road? He says, yeah, I see that road. 20%. Meaning he siphoned off 20% of the state allocation to his own pocket for building the road. And then the Japanese civil servant goes to Nigeria and gets to Nigeria and meets the counterpart in Nigeria. And the Nigerian civil servant makes $100 a month. Not $10,000 like the Japanese civil servant, and not $1,000 like the Chinese one. And his house is 100 times larger than the Japanese guy's house, which means it's got 3 rooms. I lived in Japan for 2.5 years. And once again, he poses the question, geez, you know, how is it possible that you make only $100 a month and your house is so big? And he takes him over to the window and he says, you see that road out there? And the Japanese civil servant, like me, has to stand on tippy toes and looks out and says, no, I don't see any road out there. And the Nigerian says, that's right, 100%. So in one country you have a road, and in another country you don't have a road. So that's where you got to talk about when you use terms like corruption. It's not an absolute question. It's whether you got the road or not. And then whether the road is quality enough road that it won't collapse on you, and whether your kids, if there's a earthquake, your kids won't be trapped in their school, right? It's not built out of sand, etc. There's all sorts of ways to measure these things rather than in the usual dollar terms of corruption. So that's a big problem for authoritarian regimes also in this transition phase, because sometimes the transition can involve a lot of expropriation of property. But there are those cases. Maybe you'll figure out what was the key factor and how it can be applied to other cases.
So, are there authoritarian regimes that are supported by the United States? And how do you feel about it, if there are? I think there were, but
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, I don't work for the government, so I'm not involved in any of that type of direct activity myself. But I am a citizen of the country and I pay taxes, so I have responsibility in that sense. So you pay decent money for this education here at Dartmouth would be my guess, if the prices here are anything like the prices I know back home. But I'm going to give you a discount on this one. This is called Geopolitics 101. This should do, for those of you who are ready for international relations degree, Geopolitics 101. So Geopolitics 101 is, it's really, really costly to oppose the United States. Really costly. The costs are astronomical. You can ask the Nazi regime. You can ask the Soviet regime. Right? You can ask the Japanese. It's very costly to oppose the United States. You can ask contemporary Russia. They're paying this price for reasons that you have to figure. Maybe you can figure out why the Russian regime likes to oppose the United States at every turn. It's very costly. It's also really beneficial to be on the same side as the United States. It can not always be beneficial. Sometimes it can also be ugly to be even on their same side. But if your choice is between paying the cost of opposition to the United States or trying to be partner with the United States, you take the partnership. That's Geopolitics 101. You can ask the Chinese regime. They figured this out long ago. They don't like Washington very much. They don't like American policy very much, but they're not going to pay the costs of direct confrontation with the United States. They're going to be allies and partners and reap all the benefits and pay none of the costs, because they think that eventually, perhaps, it redounds to them and they can play their own game, not just the American game. They can maybe even change the rules. So most countries understand that having some type of beneficial relationship with the United States is a good thing if they can do it. So the United States supports, to use your term, democratic regimes and non-democratic regimes all over the world. And it also undermines them sometimes, because Geopolitics 102 is that nobody can figure this Washington thing out. And they change on a dime. And they're your friend one minute and your enemy the next, and you didn't change yourself. They changed. And it's like, you know, you go on a date and they say, it's not about you, it's about me. Right? That's what Washington is like. That's Geopolitics 102. But already that's getting probably, that may be the master's level. The next level up. So yeah, we support authority. The international system is conducive to authoritarian regimes that provide stability. I think that's an observable fact. And it's also sometimes not conducive because the international system is not a system. It's a bunch of individual actors who can be very whimsical. We got any more questions or we're done? Yes.
Kind of building off of that question, you know, I know that there's a lot of doubt amongst people in America, you know, with the debt and everything. How long do you think that sort of cultural hegemony that you just mentioned, how long do you think that will last? How do you think authoritarian regimes will react to that atmosphere?
Well, there are choices now. There's the China choice. That's a really important, serious choice that countries have. And that gives them much more leverage. When there's two places to shop instead of one place to shop, sometimes the price goes down, sometimes the selection gets better, right? So that's a really important development. The future of all authoritarian regimes is linked to the China variable. If you think China is going to continue to be successful, you would bet one way for future of authoritarian regimes. If you thought China was not going to be successful continuing going forward, or was potentially going to democratize, then you would have a different geopolitical environment for all authoritarian regimes. They would have a much tougher picture going forward. So the China variable, or having choice in the system now, is really important. So having said that, U.S. power is awesome. It's really awesome. I do the world history since Genghis Khan to the present. That's one of the lecture courses I do at Princeton. And there's just nothing in history that looks like this. This kind of economic dynamism, military power, and cultural power all combined in an environment where you got Canada on one side, Mexico on the other, the Atlantic and the Pacific. That's just too good to be true. So American power is dumb, and it gets away with being dumb. It can be as dumb as it wants to be and just pick up and go on. It can invade countries. It can invade the wrong country. It can have a financial crisis. It can do just so many things to hurt itself. And there it goes. It's still going strong. Now, there's a technical problem in the United States. The United States is technically bankrupt. You notice that too? The United States is technically bankrupt till about 2030 or so. Because we have this thing that's going through the snake. So the social policy is a snake, right? And there's this thing that was born between 1946 and 64. And it's this gigantic hump that's passing through the snake. And at one point, it passed through the university system, right? And universities tripled in size in the 1960s and 70s. More college professors were hired in the 1960s and 70s than in all previous American history combined. When that 1946 to 64 birth demographic, that giant thing was passing through the snake and got to the college part, college just boomed gigantically. But they're done with college now. So colleges, they're taking those down. That stuff is toast. Those laboratories, those state systems, all that stuff is because They're in a different part of the snake now. They're in the CAT scan part of the snake. Those e-coupon rides at the hospital and that fee-for-service medical system, right? And when they pass through that part of the snake, that's it. That's bankruptcy. We're in that part right now. Till we put them all in the ground, which is a ways off. Unfortunately, it looks like you got, some people say 2030, but to me it looks like 2045. People are just living too long. Now, 50% of all Medicare spending is the last year of life. 50%. 33% of all healthcare spending in the United States is last year of life. 33% of all healthcare and 50% of Medicaid. Those are the sort of basic line statistics. So if people were dying not in the hospital, or there was a month fewer in their life, this country would have a surplus. We would be so rich we wouldn't know what to do with it. That's the cost. How to get those people in the ground. Yeah, nobody wants to give up the chance at one extra month because you don't know that the last year of life is the last year of life until you know. There's a moment when you know, and up till then, you're just ill, right? And something like they could find a cure. That's the greatest word, right, in America, a cure. And so, yeah, we're bankrupt. But bankruptcy is a technical problem. The French went bankrupt in the 18th century, and it had big consequences. Very big consequences. The British took over the world. The Qing went bankrupt in the early 19th century, and that had really big consequences. My God, the Qing bankruptcy in the first part of the 19th century, then the narco-traffickers came in, that drug cartel, otherwise known as the British Empire, forcing the sale of opium, and one thing led to another, and then there was Mao, and that was a rough patch, right? The Qing bankruptcy had very long, difficult consequences for China. So it's a non-trivial problem to go bankrupt, but there are ways to manage finances. The reason the British took over the world was because they invented the debt. They invented state debt. The French, they tried to get people to pay a little bit more in taxes. They called the Estates General, and one thing led to another, and they chopped the guy's head off, right? The British, they figured the finances out. The fiscal military state can endure very large deficits, very big expenses. You can go to war in 2 theaters simultaneously. You can occupy Japan and Germany at the same time. You can do a lot of things and incur a great deal of debt if you have a manageable system and your politics can respond and all sorts of things, right? The debt in and of itself is not necessarily debilitating. It's the ability of the system to manage these types of challenges, right? So the answer to your question is the degree of optimism one has in the political system to be able to manage this thing passing through the snake at the CAT scan stage, right? And so the money that's supposed to be spent on you is now being spent on them because they have that last year of life, right? If you have any money saved up, you should buy an intensive care bed. You should go to the hospital. There's got to be a hospital. You guys have a medical school? Oh, yeah. You go to the hospital and you chip in, like, class of 2013. You chip in and you buy an intensive care bed because it's just a cash machine. Intensive care beds are never empty. Even they clean them sometimes, the people are still in them because they generate so much money. So much money. The value of a hospital bed is no bargain, right? If you've ever stayed at something like the Ritz, Carlton, or the Four Seasons, and then you go to the hospital, you're like, oh my God, this is more than the Ritz, right? Yes, but then you go to the intensive care bed section, and that's where the big money is. And they got the specialists coming through for their drive-bys, 15 seconds, they write a little bit on the chart, 1,200, 1,800, 2,800, 4,800. They send you for the e-coupon rides. I mean, you're there a day and a half, 250,000, 300,000, 600,000 for a long week. You don't even know because you're in an intensive care bed, right? So they got you. So you got to get one for yourself. You got to get an intensive care bed, and you can do anything you want in life. You can have as many startups, and they can all fail as long as you have the cash coming in from the intensive care bed. So yeah, that's a problem. I would say that that's a deep and fundamental problem for a challenge for America. But American power, just to repeat, is really awesome. That doesn't mean it's good, but it's awesome.
Speaking of American power, I seem to be drawing a lot of parallels between the points you made about how authoritarian regimes operate and the way we operate in our foreign policy in the United States, in respect to like the global interactions between us and other nations. Can you speak to that a bit, perhaps?
You know, how to say this politely. So, the definition of authoritarianism, or its absence, is limitations on executive authority. That's the bottom line. Are there real, not just practical, but real formal limitations on executive authority? There are practical limitations on executive authority, right? For example, your infrastructure is no good, right? You have poor roads or poor railroads or poor airports, and so your executive authority can't reach into every village. It's not wired or whatever it might be, right? But I'm talking about formal institutional limits on executive authority. That's the bottom line in an authoritarian regime, right? If you ask me, is it good to expand executive authority? My answer would mostly be no. There are very few cases where it's good to expand executive authority. I like limits on executive authority. I feel much safer as an historian of the world when I see limits on executive authority. You know, enlightened despotism is a great temptation, but then they change the despot, and you're left with unenlightened despotism. So having limits on executive authority over the long term is better than having no limits and having an enlightened despot for a while doing great things. Right? The problem with big countries is that there's not that many limits on executive power when they're in the international realm. So that was the analogy that you were drawing, and I agree with that. The only limits on the analogy of executive authority in the international realm are other countries with a lot of power. But that, as Professor Wohlforth has already taught you, no doubt, that creates challenges and instabilities of its own. You know, when you have a bunch of states that are powerful, they can limit each other, but then they can also cause trouble for each other. And when you have one state that seems like it can impose its will on a system, right, be a hegemon, as it's sometimes called in the political science jargon, right, that looks like it's better, but then there are very few ways, if any, to control the power of that particular state. There are attempts, you know, coalitions, balancing coalitions, international institutions, but it's so both the hegemon problem and the multiple polarity or the multiple centers of power can be sources of instability in an international system. So yeah, you know, there's no judiciary internationally that can enforce itself without the cooperation of the powers that be. That's different from fully institutionalized limits on executive authority inside a country. Yes?
Do you treat authoritarianism as a modern phenomenon?
Yeah, so modern authoritarianism, which was the subject of this lecture, is the rule of the few in the name of the many. There are other forms of authoritarianism that don't claim to rule in the name of the many. And we could go through, I'm sure you know quite a lot of those cases too, having asked the question. But there's something about the modern period where they rule by the few, but in the name of everyone, in the name of the many. There's a mass quality to modern authoritarianism. So that's a distinction. Any more questions, or are we get done? Yes?
Yes, what is your own bet on China? Do you see any possibilities for China?
You tell me. What do you think?
I don't even know. That's why I asked.
Come on.
Well, I am from the Macau part of China, so
Okay.
not the authoritarian. I don't know. Honestly.
Yeah, so China has a lot of things going for it. A lot of things going for it. It doesn't have formal limits on executive authority, but it has informal mechanisms that limit executive authority. There's an enforced collective rule that disempowers the leader so that they don't get another Mao. So the president of China has significantly less power than the president of the United States, even though China has an authoritarian system and America has a non-authoritarian system. This is difficult for people to grasp because we have, this democratization mindset. But so China has some good things already built into the system. It also has Hong Kong, which of course is a key secret to Chinese economic success because it had a fully functional rule of law capitalist financial system inside, as it were. That's very rare. Russia had nothing to compare to Hong Kong. It also has Taiwan, which is another critically important example. Taiwan and Hong Kong made up the majority of foreign direct investment in China during the 90s, which was the crucial period of economic boom. The problem seems to be, in the Chinese case, not a recognition that the current system needs to change. They recognize that, but an understanding of the steps, the stages by which you can be stable while you're changing. Right? So recognition that change is necessary is widespread among the political elites. Understanding of how change can be introduced while the system remains overall stable is not well understood. And so that's the stasis. That's where they're stuck. They're stuck in figuring out not that they need change, but how they get change without upheaval. Those who are against change at all use this argument very powerfully. Change is equal to turmoil. But even those who are pro-change fear destabilizing the situation. Right? So what usually happens in a situation like that is nothing. They just stay where they are because they don't want to take the leap. And if they can get away with staying where they are, they will. Or external events destabilize the situation, right? The thing about structures is that events can intervene unexpectedly, right? The famous quote of Harold Macmillan, who will be unknown in this room, but was once an important figure in the British political establishment, and things were going swimmingly, and they said, what could upset the situation? And he said, events, dear boy, events. So sometimes reluctancy to move and stasis can be upended by ways that people don't foresee. Like the Soviet Union collapses, and all of a sudden, you got to figure out why that shouldn't happen to you. Right? And so things can happen around China that could affect the calculus of whether to move or not. Still, nonetheless, it has to be said that the Chinese story is just really, really impressive. Just a really impressive story. 30 years of market economics without the rule of law, in total defiance of American social science, is a spectacular achievement. They have private property without property rights, and they have a market economy without the rule of law. None of which is possible, and both of which have been going on for most of my adult life. So that's a really impressive story. But the issue with China is not can they continue in the same vein. That's never the issue. The issue is there resiliency in there or not? In other words, when the crisis comes, because everything experiences a crisis, do they bounce back, or does the whole thing fall down? It's not the crisis, it's the resiliency and the ability to respond to the crisis. That we have no idea. People are very, let's say, there's no consensus. The disagreement is very wide on the resiliency that's built into the China system. I'm not a China expert, but talking to China experts, that's the impression that I get.
One last question.
We got 3 hands up. What do you want to do? He asked already once. You asked once. You didn't ask yet. I think that'd be fair.
You said you were talking about modern authoritarian regimes today.
Excuse me 1 second.
So, what would you consider the first modern authoritarian regime?
Yeah. You know, that's a semi-semantic problem, and you will get some disagreement on that. Many people consider Napoleon the kind of instigator of this stuff, where he had an eye to the mass, and he was willing to use authoritarian techniques that were populist. So that's one place you could start. Others consider Little Napoleon, the farce part, you know. What did Marx say? First time tragedy, second time farce. Little Napoleon, or Napoleon III, who introduced universal suffrage because he thought the peasants would vote for his authoritarian, and they did. So sometimes Little Napoleon is considered the one. Sometimes Bismarck is considered the one. But Bismarck, it didn't work. His system, it was not sufficiently wide political base. And so his system came apart. The German system came apart. So for my own purposes, I would say that these are precursors to modern authoritarianism, who introduced the kind of idea of how you do this. Are we good on that?
We're good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.